Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for over 13 years, and throughout that time, he had witnessed countless moments that touched his heart, made him laugh, and reminded him why he loved bringing families together on television. But nothing could have prepared him for what would unfold on a warm Wednesday afternoon in October 2024. What started as another routine taping would become one of the most powerful demonstrations of dignity, respect, and moral courage ever captured on a game show. This is a story about standing up for people who deserve honor, about confronting prejudice when it reveals itself, and about why representation and respect matter more than ratings or politeness. If you believe in treating all people with dignity regardless of how they speak, make sure to like and subscribe to this channel, because what happened next will remind you that sometimes the most important moments happen when good people refuse to stay silent. The Washington family from Atlanta, Georgia, stood on one side of the Family Feud stage, and they brought with them a presence that filled the entire studio with warmth and authenticity. James Washington, a 63-year-old retired postal worker, had worked for the United States Postal Service for 41 years before retiring with full honors. His wife Dorothy, 60 years old, had spent her entire career as an elementary school teacher in the Atlanta public schools, shaping young minds and instilling values in thousands of children over 3 decades. Their adult children stood beside them, each one a testament to the values their parents had instilled. Their daughter Keisha was a social worker who specialized in helping families navigate the foster care system. Their son Marcus was a high school history teacher who had won multiple awards for his innovative teaching methods. Their youngest, Tamara, was completing her residency as a pediatrician at Grady Memorial Hospital. This was a family that embodied service, dedication, and quiet excellence. The Washington family spoke with what linguists call African-American vernacular English, a rich and complex dialect with its own grammatical rules, historical development, and cultural significance. Their speech patterns reflected their roots in the Deep South, their connection to generations of family history, and their pride in their cultural identity. When they spoke, their words carried the musicality and rhythm that characterized their community, their church, and their heritage. They used phrases and expressions that had been passed down through their family for generations, linguistic patterns that connected them to their ancestors and to a broader African-American cultural tradition. There was nothing wrong with how they spoke. Their communication was clear, expressive, and filled with personality. But prejudice does not require logic, and what happened next would reveal just how deeply some people harbor contempt for those who speak differently. On the opposite side of the stage stood the Mitchell family from suburban Connecticut, led by 48-year-old Gregory Mitchell, a corporate consultant who specialized in executive training and leadership development. His wife Amanda was a real estate agent in one of Connecticut's wealthiest communities. Their children, all in their 20s, had attended prestigious private schools and Ivy League universities. The Mitchell family presented themselves with the polished confidence of people who had always moved in circles of privilege and had rarely encountered anyone who challenged their assumptions or made them question their biases. Gregory Mitchell carried himself with the particular arrogance of someone who believed his success was entirely self-made, and that anyone who had less must have worked less hard or been less capable. Steve Harvey walked onto the stage with his signature energy, ready to bring his warmth and humor to another episode. He had reviewed the family introductions and was particularly excited about the Washington family's story. James and Dorothy Washington had been married for 42 years, having met at a church social in Atlanta when they were both teenagers. They had raised their children with strong values, emphasizing education, service to community, and pride in their heritage. Their family had overcome significant challenges, including periods of financial struggle, health crises, and the everyday discrimination that Black families in America navigate constantly. But they had persevered with grace, faith, and an unshakable commitment to each other. Steve saw in them a reflection of his own family's journey, and he was eager to celebrate their story on national television. The game began with the usual excitement and competitive energy. Both families demonstrated quick thinking and good knowledge of popular survey answers. The Washington family took an early lead, with James showing impressive recall and Dorothy providing answers that reflected both common sense and deep cultural awareness. After each correct answer, the Washington family celebrated with genuine joy, encouraging each other with phrases like "that's right" and "go on now." Their enthusiasm was infectious, and the studio audience responded with warm applause and laughter. They were exactly the kind of family that made Family Feud special, bringing authentic personality and family dynamics to the stage. But as the game progressed, Gregory Mitchell's demeanor began to shift. What had started as competitive energy curdled into something darker. When the Washington family scored points, Gregory would mutter comments under his breath. When Dorothy Washington gave an answer using a phrase that reflected her Southern dialect, Gregory smirked and exchanged knowing glances with his family members. The contempt was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as mere competitiveness or frustration at falling behind. But it was building towards something that would soon explode into the open. The moment came during the fourth round when the question on the board asked contestants to name something people say when they are surprised. Keisha Washington stepped up to the podium with confidence, and when Steve asked for her answer, she responded with authentic enthusiasm and in her natural speaking voice. Her answer was, "You ain't never lied," a common expression in African-American vernacular English that conveys agreement and affirmation, often used when someone says something surprisingly true or relatable. It was a perfectly valid answer that would likely appear on the survey board, as it reflected how millions of Americans actually speak in their daily lives. Before Steve could even turn to check the board, Gregory Mitchell's voice cut through the studio with a mocking imitation of Keisha's accent. He exaggerated the pronunciation, twisted his face into a caricature, and then turned to his family with a theatrical laugh, saying loud enough for the microphones to catch, "I guess they don't teach proper English in Atlanta schools anymore. Maybe if they spent less time talking like that and more time learning how to speak correctly, they wouldn't be so." He trailed off, but the implication was clear and devastating. The studio fell into a shocked silence. The Washington family's earlier joy and enthusiasm evaporated instantly, replaced by a mixture of hurt, anger, and profound disappointment. Keisha's face showed the particular pain of someone who had worked her entire life to prove herself, who had excelled academically and professionally, who had overcome countless obstacles, only to be reduced to a racist caricature on national television. Dorothy Washington instinctively reached for her daughter's hand, her own eyes filling with tears. James Washington stood taller, his jaw clenched, his expression showing the controlled fury of a man who had encountered this kind of disrespect before and had learned through painful experience how to maintain his dignity in the face of hatred. Marcus put a protective arm around his sister, while Tamara looked like she wanted to walk off the stage entirely. Steve Harvey stopped completely. The transformation in his demeanor was immediate and absolute. The smile that had been his trademark for over a decade vanished from his face. His entire body language changed as he slowly turned toward Gregory Mitchell with an expression of such controlled anger and moral authority that everyone in the studio recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented. This was no longer a game show host managing a friendly competition. This was a black man who had spent his entire life navigating racism, who had built a career in an industry that often disrespected and undervalued black talent, who had worked too hard and come too far to allow this kind of hatred to go unchallenged on his stage. Steve walked directly toward Gregory Mitchell, his movements deliberate and purposeful. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried throughout the studio with perfect clarity, each word weighted with decades of experience and crystalline moral conviction. What he said next would be replayed millions of times, studied in communications courses, quoted in articles about confronting racism, and remembered as one of the most powerful moments in television history. "Sir, I need you to explain something to me," Steve began, his eyes locked on Gregory with an intensity that made the other man visibly uncomfortable. "I need you to explain what you find so amusing about the way this family speaks. I need you to tell everyone in this studio and everyone watching at home exactly what you meant by that comment. Because from where I'm standing, what I just heard was racism, pure and simple, and I want to make absolutely certain that I understood you correctly before I respond." Gregory Mitchell attempted to backtrack immediately, claiming it was just a joke, that people were being too sensitive, that he had nothing against anyone and was simply pointing out differences in dialect. His excuses came fast and desperate, each one revealing more clearly that he knew exactly what he had done and was now trying to avoid the consequences. He claimed he had black friends, that he supported diversity, that this was all being blown out of proportion. Steve did not interrupt, allowing Gregory to dig his hole deeper with every word, giving him every opportunity to show the studio audience and viewers at home exactly what kind of person he was beneath the polished exterior. When Gregory finally stopped talking, Steve took a deep breath and delivered a response that would become legendary. His words combined personal testimony, historical awareness, cultural education, and moral clarity in a way that left no room for ambiguance or deflection. Mr. Mitchell, let me educate you about something that apparently you have never learned in all your years of prestigious schooling and corporate success, Steve said, his voice growing stronger with each word. The Washington family speaks African-American vernacular English, which is a legitimate dialect with its own consistent grammatical rules and rich history. Linguists and scholars have studied it extensively and recognize it as a valid form of communication. It is not broken English. It is not incorrect English. It is not a sign of lack of education or intelligence. It is a dialect that carries the history, culture, and resilience of millions of African Americans who have contributed immeasurably to this country despite facing constant disrespect from people who think they are better because they speak differently. Steve gestured toward the Washington family, who stood together in solidarity, their dignity intact despite the attack they had just endured. James Washington worked for the United States Postal Service for 41 years. He delivered mail through snow, rain, heat, and whatever else nature threw at him. He provided for his family, raised his children to be outstanding citizens, and retired with honor. Dorothy Washington spent 30 years shaping young minds as an elementary school teacher. She taught children to read, to think, to dream, to believe in themselves. Their children are a social worker helping vulnerable families, a teacher inspiring the next generation, and a doctor saving lives. This family has contributed more to society in their service and their values than most people ever will. The studio audience began to applaud, but Steve raised his hand to indicate he was not finished. He turned his attention back to Gregory Mitchell with renewed intensity. You want to mock how they speak? Let me tell you what I hear when the Washington family talks. I hear resilience. I hear history. I hear a family that has maintained their cultural identity despite centuries of people trying to strip it away from them. I hear pride. I hear authenticity. I hear people who are comfortable in their own skin and do not feel the need to change themselves to make others more comfortable. Steve's voice took on a harder edge as he continued. But you know what I heard from you, Mr. Mitchell? I heard insecurity. I heard someone who needs to make himself feel superior by putting others down. I heard someone who thinks success means looking down on people who are different. I heard someone who has probably benefited from privilege his whole life and thinks that makes him better than people who had to work twice as hard to achieve half as much recognition. The camera captured Gregory Mitchell's face, which had gone from smirking confidence to red-faced humiliation. His family members stood in awkward silence, clearly uncomfortable but not brave enough to speak up or defend him. Steve was not done delivering his message. I want everyone watching to understand something very important, Steve said, now addressing the cameras directly. Linguistic prejudice is real discrimination. When you mock someone's accent or dialect, when you suggest that the way they speak makes them less intelligent or less worthy of respect, you are engaging in a form of racism and classism. You are using language as a weapon to marginalize and dehumanize people. And on this stage, in this space that is supposed to celebrate families and bring people together, that will never be tolerated. Steve walked back toward the Washington family, his entire demeanor softening as he approached them. He stopped in front of Dorothy Washington first, and what he said to her brought tears to the eyes of everyone in the studio who had a heart and a conscience. Mrs. Washington, I want to apologize on behalf of this show for what just happened to your family, Steve said with genuine emotion. You and your family came here to have fun, to celebrate your bonds, to compete in a game you have watched together for years, and instead you were subjected to racism and mockery. That is unacceptable, and I am profoundly sorry that it happened in this space. Dorothy Washington, tears streaming down her face, squeezed Steve's hand and spoke with quiet dignity. Mr. Harvey, my whole life I have dealt with people who thought the way I talk meant I was ignorant or incapable. I became a teacher because I wanted to show children that intelligence comes in all forms, that wisdom can be expressed in many different ways, and that no one should ever be made to feel ashamed of their voice or their heritage. Thank you for standing up for us. Thank you for using your platform to say what needed to be said. Steve turned to Keisha, who was still visibly shaken from being the direct target of Gregory's mockery. Sweetheart, your answer was brilliant. You ain't never lied is an authentic expression of surprise and agreement that millions of people use every single day. It is vivid, it is expressive, and it carries meaning and emotion in a way that formal standard English sometimes cannot capture. There is nothing wrong with how you speak. There is nothing that needs to be corrected or improved. Your voice is powerful exactly as it is. Then Steve turned back toward Gregory Mitchell, and the warmth that had filled his voice when speaking to the Washington family disappeared completely, replaced by steel and absolute moral authority. "Mr. Mitchell, you and your family are done here. You are leaving this stage immediately. Family Feud is a celebration of families from all backgrounds, all walks of life, all ways of speaking and being in the world. We do not give a platform to people who use difference as an excuse for disrespect. We do not tolerate racism in any form, including linguistic prejudice. You had an opportunity today to compete alongside a remarkable family and perhaps learn something about grace, resilience, and dignity. Instead, you chose to reveal the smallness of your character. Your time here is over." The studio audience erupted in applause, a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Through the applause, security personnel arrived to escort the Mitchell family from the studio. Gregory Mitchell protested, claiming his rights were being violated, that this was censorship, that Steve was overreacting to a simple joke. His protests fell on deaf ears. The producers had made their decision instantly and unanimously. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to apologize and continue. Racism had no place on the Family Feud stage, and the consequences were immediate and absolute. As the Mitchell family departed, Steve made an announcement that would have far-reaching implications. He told the Washington family that not only would they be declared the winners of the game by default, but they would also compete in the fast money round for a chance to win the grand prize. More importantly, he announced that he would be creating a special segment highlighting the beauty and legitimacy of African-American vernacular English, featuring linguists and cultural historians who could educate viewers about the rich history and grammatical complexity of the dialect. During the commercial break, Steve spent time with each member of the Washington family, making sure they felt supported and valued. James Washington shook Steve's hand firmly and told him that what he had done meant more than any game show prize ever could. "My father fought in World War II," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "He came home to a country that still treated him like a second-class citizen despite his service. He dealt with discrimination every single day of his life. But he always told us to hold our heads high, to never let anyone make us feel small, to be proud of who we are and where we come from." What you did today honored his memory and honored every person who has been made to feel ashamed of their voice. Marcus Washington, the history teacher, had his own perspective to share. "Mr. Harvey, I teach my students about the civil rights movement, about the struggle for dignity and equality. But sometimes the most important battles are not the dramatic ones that make history books. Sometimes it is about standing up in everyday moments, when someone makes a racist joke or mocks someone's accent. Those small moments of resistance add up to real change. Thank you for showing my students and young people everywhere what it looks like to take a stand." Tamara Washington, the medical resident, spoke about her experiences in healthcare. "In the hospital, I sometimes have patients or even colleagues who make assumptions about my competence based on how I speak. They hear my accent and they assume I am less educated or less capable. I have had to work twice as hard to prove myself, to demonstrate that I belong in that white coat. What happened here today, this validation that my voice is legitimate and valuable exactly as it is, that means everything to me." The fast money round proceeded with the Washington family demonstrating impressive teamwork and knowledge. They did not achieve a perfect score, but they won substantial prize money that would help support their family and their community. But more valuable than any monetary prize was what happened when the episode aired 3 weeks later. The response was immediate, overwhelming, and complex. Millions of people praised Steve Harvey for his moral courage and his passionate defense of the Washington family. Social media exploded with messages of support from people sharing their own experiences of linguistic discrimination, of being mocked for their accents, of having to code switch between different dialects depending on their environment. Teachers, linguists, and cultural scholars reached out to commend Steve for using his platform to educate about linguistic diversity and to challenge the prejudice that treats some ways of speaking as inherently superior to others. The American Dialect Society issued a statement thanking Steve Harvey for highlighting the legitimacy of African-American vernacular English and for challenging the linguistic prejudice that has marginalized speakers of the dialect for generations. Several major universities invited the Washington family to speak about their experience, and Dorothy Washington's perspective as a longtime educator became particularly valued in discussions about classroom diversity and inclusive teaching practices. However, there was also predictable backlash. Some viewers accused Steve of being too sensitive, of making too big a deal out of what they characterized as harmless humor. Some defended Gregory Mitchell's right to his opinion and criticized what they saw as political correctness run amok. These responses revealed how deeply linguistic prejudice is embedded in American culture, how many people genuinely believe that some ways of speaking are objectively better than others, and how resistant many are to examining their own biases. Steve Harvey addressed the criticism directly in multiple interviews, never wavering from his position. He explained that respecting linguistic diversity was not about political correctness, but about basic human dignity. He pointed out that linguistic prejudice has been used throughout history as a tool of oppression, a way to marginalize and control populations by insisting they abandon their native dialects and conform to dominant speech patterns. He discussed how Black children are often punished in schools for speaking AAVE, how job candidates are discriminated against based on their accents, and how linguistic prejudice intersects with racism in profound and damaging ways. The story of the Washington family continued to unfold in unexpected and inspiring ways. Within a month of the episode airing, Dorothy Washington was invited to speak at a national education conference about linguistic diversity in the classroom and the importance of validating all students' home languages while also teaching them to navigate different linguistic contexts. Her presentation was so well received that she began developing a teacher training program focused on culturally responsive pedagogy and linguistic inclusion. Keisha Washington, the social worker, found that her experience on Family Feud opened up new opportunities to advocate for families in the foster care system. She began speaking publicly about how linguistic prejudice affects family assessments, how caseworkers sometimes make negative judgments about parents based on how they speak rather than focusing on their actual parenting capabilities. Her advocacy led to changes in training protocols for social workers in several states. Marcus Washington incorporated the experience into his history curriculum, using the incident as a teaching moment about modern civil rights issues and the ongoing struggle against discrimination. He had his students analyze the incident from multiple perspectives, study the history of linguistic prejudice in America, and connect it to broader patterns of racism and cultural hegemony. His innovative curriculum was recognized with a Teaching Excellence Award. Tamara Washington became an advocate for linguistic diversity in medical settings, speaking about how healthcare professionals need to respect patients' dialects and communication styles rather than making assumptions about their intelligence or compliance based on how they speak. She co-authored a paper on linguistic bias in medical care that was published in a major medical journal. Steve Harvey, true to his promise, developed a special segment that aired as part of his talk show, featuring interviews with linguists who explained the grammatical complexity and historical development of African American vernacular English. The segment included testimony from speakers of AAVE about their experiences with linguistic discrimination and their pride in their dialect. It became one of the most watched and most discussed episodes of his talk show, generating conversations about language, culture, and respect that extended far beyond the usual talk show audience. The scholarship fund that Steve established in honor of the Washington family specifically supported students who spoke AAVE or other marginalized dialects, providing them with resources to pursue higher education while maintaining their cultural and linguistic identity. The fund emphasized that students should not have to abandon their home dialects to succeed academically, but rather should be supported in developing the ability to navigate multiple linguistic contexts while maintaining pride in their cultural heritage. 1 year after the incident, the Washington family was invited back to Family Feud for a special anniversary episode. This time, the atmosphere was purely celebratory. Steve welcomed them with warmth and genuine affection, and the episode became a platform for showcasing everything the family had accomplished in the year since their original appearance. They shared how the experience had opened up new opportunities for advocacy and education, how they had connected with thousands of people who shared similar experiences, and how they had used their platform to make real change. During this anniversary episode, Steve revealed something that the audience did not know. In the year since the original incident, he had hired a linguistic diversity consultant to work with his production team, ensuring that Family Feud and his other shows celebrated rather than stigmatized linguistic diversity. He had also mandated training for all his staff on recognizing and challenging linguistic prejudice. The changes he implemented became a model that other production companies began to follow. The most moving moment of the anniversary episode came when Dorothy Washington presented Steve with a gift from her family. It was a framed piece of fabric from the dress she had worn during their original Family Feud appearance, embroidered with words from Steve's defense of their family. The embroidery read, "Your voice is powerful exactly as it is." Dorothy explained that she had created it as a reminder of the day someone with a platform used it to defend people who are often silenced or dismissed. Steve accepted the gift with visible emotion and promised that it would hang in his office where he could see it every day. He told the Washington family that they had taught him just as much as he had taught them, that their grace and resilience had inspired him to be more intentional about using his platform for education and advocacy, and that he considered it one of the great honors of his career to have stood up for them that day. The story of what happened on that Wednesday afternoon in October 2024 became part of a larger cultural conversation about linguistic justice and the need to respect all varieties of language. It was studied in linguistics courses as an example of how linguistic prejudice manifests in everyday interactions. It was discussed in diversity and inclusion training as an example of how to confront bias when it occurs. It was shared in Black communities as an affirmation that their dialects are legitimate and valuable, that they do not need to change themselves to be worthy of respect. Gregory Mitchell eventually issued a public apology, though many found it inadequate and performative. He claimed to have undergone diversity training and to have learned about his implicit biases. Whether this represented genuine growth or damage control remained a matter of debate. His employer, facing public pressure and internal complaints from employees, terminated his contract as a consultant, citing a values mismatch. The controversy cost him professionally and personally, though he continued to claim he was the real victim in the situation. The incident sparked a broader movement in media and entertainment to challenge linguistic prejudice. Several major networks implemented guidelines about respectful portrayal of dialects and accents. Casting directors began actively seeking actors who spoke AAVE and other marginalized dialects for roles that had traditionally been reserved for speakers of standard American English. Writers' rooms became more diverse, bringing in people who could authentically represent different linguistic communities without resorting to stereotypes or caricatures. Educational institutions also began to shift their approaches. More schools implemented programs that validated students' home languages while teaching them to navigate different linguistic contexts. Teachers received training on recognizing their own linguistic biases and creating inclusive classroom environments where all students felt their voices were valued. Research on linguistic diversity in education received increased funding and attention. 3 years after the original incident, a documentary was produced about the Washington family and the impact of that single moment on Family Feud. The documentary featured interviews with linguists, educators, community leaders, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the Washington family's story. It explored the history of linguistic prejudice in America, the systematic ways that African American vernacular English has been stigmatized and marginalized, and the resistance and resilience of communities who have maintained their linguistic heritage despite pressure to assimilate. The documentary included powerful testimony from people across the country who shared how they had been discriminated against because of their accents or dialects. There were stories of job candidates rejected despite qualifications because of how they spoke, of students punished or placed in remedial classes based on linguistic prejudice rather than actual academic ability, of parents judged in custody hearings or child welfare investigations based on their dialects. Each story illustrated the real-world consequences of treating some ways of speaking as inferior to others. But the documentary also celebrated the beauty, complexity, and expressiveness of linguistic diversity. It featured poets, musicians, and storytellers who used AAVE and other dialects to create art that moved and inspired. It included testimony from linguists who explained how all dialects are equally complex and rule-governed, how linguistic variation is natural and valuable, and how the idea of one correct way to speak is a social construct rather than a linguistic reality. The documentary's finale brought together everyone who had been part of the story for a reunion. Steve Harvey, the Washington family, linguistic scholars, educators, and community advocates all gathered to reflect on what had changed in the 3 years since that Family Feud episode aired. The consensus was that while significant progress had been made, much work remained to be done. Linguistic prejudice was still widespread, and speakers of marginalized dialects still faced discrimination in employment, education, healthcare, and countless other contexts. James Washington, now retired and spending his time mentoring young people in his community, spoke about the ongoing nature of the struggle. What happened to us on Family Feud was just one moment, one instance of something that happens to people every single day. The difference was that we had someone with a platform who was willing to stand up and say it was wrong. Most people do not have that. Most people just have to swallow the disrespect and keep moving. That is why this work of education and advocacy is so important. We need to change hearts and minds, help people understand that difference is not deficiency, and create a society where everyone's voice is valued. Dorothy Washington, who had retired from teaching but remained active in educational advocacy, emphasized the role of educators. Teachers have so much power to shape how children see themselves and others. If a teacher treats a child's dialect as wrong or broken, that child internalizes shame about who they are. But if a teacher validates the child's home language while also teaching them to navigate different contexts, that child develops confidence and linguistic flexibility. We need more teachers who understand that their job is not to erase difference, but to build on the linguistic resources students bring with them. Steve Harvey, reflecting on how the experience had changed him, spoke about the responsibility that comes with having a platform. I always knew I wanted to use my success to make a difference, but this experience taught me that sometimes making a difference means being willing to make people uncomfortable. It means calling out racism and prejudice even when it would be easier to smooth things over and keep the show moving. It means prioritizing human dignity over ratings or commercial considerations. The Washington family trusted me to create a space where they would be treated with respect, and when that trust was violated, I had a choice. I could have minimized it, made excuses, tried to keep everyone happy, or I could stand up and say clearly that what happened was wrong. I made the right choice that day, and I would make it again. As the documentary ended, viewers were presented with resources for learning more about linguistic diversity, for challenging linguistic prejudice in their own communities, and for supporting organizations working on linguistic justice. The final image was of the Washington family together, speaking in their authentic voices, their pride and dignity undiminished, their impact immeasurable. The story of Steve Harvey shutting down the man who mocked the Washington family's accent on live television became more than just a viral moment or a powerful television clip. It became a touchstone in ongoing conversations about respect, dignity, and the value of linguistic diversity. It reminded millions of people that how someone speaks tells you nothing about their intelligence, their character, or their worth as a human being. It demonstrated that standing up to prejudice requires courage, but creates change. And it proved that sometimes the most important thing you can do is use whatever platform you have to defend people who deserve honor and respect. The Washington family continued to live their lives with the same values that had guided them before their Family Feud appearance. They remained active in their community, continued their service-oriented careers, and maintained their pride in their cultural and linguistic heritage. But they also carried with them the knowledge that their experience had made a difference, that their willingness to be vulnerable on national television had opened up important conversations and created opportunities for education and change. Steve Harvey continued to host Family Feud for many years, but he often cited the Washington family incident as the most important moment of his hosting career. He kept Dorothy Washington's embroidered fabric in his office, and he would look at it before particularly challenging tapings or difficult decisions. It reminded him that his platform came with responsibility, that every family who stepped onto his stage deserved to be treated with dignity, and that silence in the face of prejudice was its own form of participation. The lesson that emerged from this story was both simple and profound. Language is deeply connected to identity, culture, and community. When we mock or stigmatize how someone speaks, we are attacking not just their words but their sense of self, their connection to their heritage, and their right to exist authentically in the world. True respect means valuing all forms of linguistic expression, recognizing that diversity makes us richer rather than poorer, and refusing to allow prejudice to masquerade as standards or correctness. If this story moved you, if you believe that everyone deserves respect regardless of how they speak, make sure to like and subscribe. These are the stories that remind us of our shared humanity and our responsibility to stand up for dignity, to challenge prejudice wherever we encounter it, and to create a world where every voice is valued and every person is honored for who they are.